In the cradle of human history, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, lies the ancient land of Mesopotamia. This region, whose name means "between the rivers" in Greek, bore witness to the dawn of civilization. From as early as 10,000 BCE, human beings began to settle its fertile floodplains, laying the foundation for some of the world's first urban societies. By the 4th millennium BCE, the southern part of Mesopotamia, Sumer, was home to bustling city-states like Uruk, Eridu, and Ur. These cities were not merely clusters of dwellings, but complex hubs of administration, religion, and trade. Monumental architecture arose, including the earliest known temples called ziggurats, stepped platforms that reached skyward as a testament to human devotion and social organization. The Sumerians, who spoke a language unrelated to any known linguistic group, are credited with inventing cuneiform script around 3200 BCE. This wedge-shaped writing system, inscribed on clay tablets with a reed stylus, marks one of the greatest milestones in human communication. Initially used for record-keeping, cuneiform evolved to express myths, hymns, laws, and epics, most famously, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Society in Mesopotamia was deeply hierarchical. Kings claimed divine favor, and temples held vast economic power, functioning as religious, administrative, and industrial centers. The Code of Hammurabi, issued in the 18th century BCE by Babylon's famous ruler, exemplifies the region's legal sophistication, outlining justice through a detailed set of laws. Agriculture thrived thanks to irrigation, which harnessed the river's unpredictable floods. Canals, levees, and reservoirs enabled farmers to grow barley, wheat, dates, and flax. Domesticated animals, particularly oxen and donkeys, played a vital role in transport and labor. Over the centuries, Mesopotamia saw the rise and fall of powerful empires: Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Neo-Babylonian. Each left its mark. Sargon's empire pioneered centralized rule, Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal created vast libraries, and Nebuchadnezzar II adorned Babylon with the fabled Hanging Gardens. Despite frequent warfare and shifting powers, Mesopotamian culture endured. Innovations in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine emerged, many of which influenced later civilizations. Their division of time into 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles persists to this day. By the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire absorbed Mesopotamia. Though politically subsumed, its cultural legacy lived on, etched in clay, in stone, and in the shared memory of humanity. Mesopotamia remains a testament to the human spirit's capacity to build, to imagine, and to endure. With the Persian conquest came a new era, yet the cities of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Nineveh, Ur, remained vibrant symbols of human creativity. Scholars continued to study ancient texts, temples still rose toward the sky, and the rhythm of life, though altered, persisted. In these urban centers, scribes trained in the cuneiform tradition kept the records of trade, astronomy, and administration. Temples retained their role as centers of power, now integrated into the broader imperial structure. Meanwhile, the legacy of older dynasties, of kings and warriors, lawgivers and poets, was remembered in tale and tablet. The Seleucid and Parthian periods followed, bringing with them Hellenistic influences that mingled with local traditions. Greek language and art merged with Babylonian science and Assyrian sculpture, producing a hybrid culture reflective of Mesopotamia's resilience. In time, the sands of the desert and the silt of the rivers buried the remains of this once flourishing land. Yet beneath the earth, the cities lay dormant, their secrets waiting to be uncovered by curious minds centuries later. Archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries brought Mesopotamia back into the light. With every artifact unearthed, with every tablet translated, the voices of ancient peoples spoke again, revealing not only the workings of states and temples, but also the joys and fears of daily life. As excavation expanded and scholarship deepened, a clearer portrait of Mesopotamian civilization emerged. We learned of their vast trade networks stretching from the Indus Valley to the Anatolian highlands. We traced their influence in the legal codes of distant lands and found echoes of their myths in later religious traditions. The Mesopotamians were not merely recorders of the stars, they were architects of the cosmos, seeking order in the heavens and meaning in the cycles of time. Their ziggurats stood not only as temples but as symbolic mountains, connecting earth and sky. Their gods, many and powerful, mirrored the complexity of life itself, uncertain, fertile, terrifying, and divine. Today, though modern cities rise above ancient soil, the legacy of Mesopotamia endures. In the words we write, in the laws we uphold, in the numbers we count, traces of the distant world remain. It was a civilization of builders and thinkers, of poets and rulers, of farmers and warriors. Above all, it was a civilization of memory, one that calls to us still, from between the rivers. Mesopotamia is not just a place on the map, nor a chapter in an ancient chronicle. It is a mirror in which we may glimpse the long reflection of ourselves. For in its cities, we find the first stirrings of urban life, in its temples, the earliest echoes of collective worship, and in its tablets, the very birth of written thought. Though time has worn away its bricks and scattered its treasures, the essence of Mesopotamia endures, in the tools we wield, the stories we share, and the questions we still ask about the meaning of our past. It reminds us that civilization is both fragile and enduring, shaped by rivers and rain, by fire and desire. As long as we seek to understand who we are and where we came from, Mesopotamia will remain with us, timeless, silent, and profound. Though the great cities of Mesopotamia eventually fell silent, their influence resonated across continents. The concept of kingship, first articulated in the royal hymns of Sumer, would echo through the monarchies of Persia, Rome, and beyond. The practice of law, born from clay tablets and public steles, became a cornerstone of governance from Hammurabi to Justinian. Religious ideas, too, traveled far. The flood myth of Utnapishtim found parallels in the Hebrew tale of Noah. The Tower of Babel recalled ancient ziggurats striving toward heaven. And in the whispering winds of the desert, one still hears the questions they once posed, about fate, justice, and the gods' mysterious will. Their art, with its stylized bearded figures and winged beasts, left a mark on the iconography of later cultures. Their mathematics, based on a sexagesimal system, laid the groundwork for the measurement of time and angles. Their astronomy, patient and precise, tracked the stars not for curiosity alone, but to align heaven's order with Earth's fate. Mesopotamia's people, though long gone, remain with us in the most intimate ways. In the 7-day week. In the concept of contracts and receipts. In the stories we tell of heroism, hubris, and the search for meaning. And so, the history of Mesopotamia is not a tale that ends, it is a river that flows into our present, nourishing our understanding of who we are. It reminds us that civilization is a fragile achievement, born of cooperation, imagination, and the endless struggle against chaos. In remembering them, we honor ourselves. ChatGPT. As we move further along the stream of time, we find that Mesopotamia's legacy did not vanish with the dust of its temples. Rather, it seeped quietly into the foundations of other great civilizations. The Greeks, who admired Babylon's wisdom, drew upon its astronomy and geographical knowledge. The Romans, inheritors of many traditions, adapted elements of Mesopotamian law and governance into their vast empire. Even in medieval times, scholars in Baghdad, the city that would rise near the ruins of Ctesiphon, translated and preserved ancient Mesopotamian science. Their libraries echoed with the memory of scribes from long ago, keeping alive texts on medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. These, in turn, would find their way to Europe during the Renaissance, feeding a rebirth of learning that owed more than it knew to the lands between the rivers. Today, we often take for granted the most mundane aspects of modern life that owe their origins to Mesopotamia. The idea of recording transactions, the formalization of contracts, the division of labor within cities, the concept of a written curriculum. All these sprang from the earliest efforts of Sumerian and Akkadian thinkers trying to bring order to their world. But perhaps the greatest gift of Mesopotamia is its story. Theirs was not a civilization of grand illusions or eternal triumphs. It was a world of struggle, against nature, against time, against the limits of human strength. And yet, they built. They dreamed. They recorded their thoughts in clay, trusting that someone, someday, might listen. And we do. The story of Mesopotamia, of Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria, is the story of how humanity first learned to live together in great numbers. It is the tale of the first cities and of the problems that came with them. How does one feed a large population? How are disputes resolved? Who owns the land, and who governs the people? These questions were first asked and answered by the people of Mesopotamia. They did so not with simplicity, but with nuance. Their records show legal arguments, family inheritances, and administrative orders, all handled with care. Contracts were detailed. Debts were tracked. Injustice was not merely condemned, it was weighed and measured. And alongside the daily business of cities, there was imagination. The gods of Mesopotamia were numerous and vivid: Enlil, the lord of the wind; Inanna, goddess of love and war; Ninhursag, the earth mother; and Marduk, the slayer of chaos. Their myths were not distant fables but deeply embedded in the rituals and rhythms of life. Each festival, each omen, each star in the sky was part of a larger conversation between the human and the divine. Their art, too, spoke volumes. The walls of palaces and temples bore scenes of battle, of royal processions, and of divine blessings. Every carving was a message, a declaration of power, a plea for protection, or a story meant to be remembered. Even in death, they left behind tablets and seals, knowing that memory itself was a kind of immortality. And so, the cities grew. Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, once held perhaps 50,000 people, an enormous number for its time. With walls that stretched for miles, it was a marvel of early urban planning. Streets, markets, temples, and homes formed a dense network of life and purpose. Other cities followed suit: Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and Ur, each contributing to the tapestry of Mesopotamian identity. The rulers of these cities claimed more than political power. They claimed a sacred role. Some, like Gudea of Lagash, are remembered for their building and piety. Others, like Sargon of Akkad, for their military might. And some, like Hammurabi, for their wisdom in law. Their names live on not just because of what they built, but because they helped define what civilization itself could be. And yet, nothing in Mesopotamia was eternal. Dynasties rose and fell. Temples crumbled. Canals dried or shifted. Empires fractured. The same rivers that gave life could also destroy, and invasions came from all sides, from the highlands, the deserts, and the sea. But each time, something survived. A tablet buried in the earth. A fragment of a hymn. A forgotten word carved into stone. These remnants, delicate yet enduring, became the foundation for modern discovery. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century opened a flood of knowledge. From the libraries of Ashurbanipal to the archives of Mari, tens of thousands of texts poured forth, administrative records, mathematical problems, letters, omens, and poems. We learned that the people of Mesopotamia knew their world intimately and sought to explain it with clarity and care. Their understanding of medicine, though limited by their time, showed remarkable observation. They catalogued symptoms, recommended treatments, and recognized the emotional weight of illness. Their astronomy, based on millennia of observation, allowed them to predict eclipses and track planetary motion. Their mathematics, built on a base 60 system, allowed them to solve complex problems in land measurement and accounting. They were not perfect. Their societies were rigidly stratified, with vast inequalities between free men, dependents, and slaves. Women's rights varied widely over time and region, sometimes protected by law, other times constrained. War was frequent, and rulers often boasted of brutality. But these are not reasons to dismiss their achievements. They are reminders that civilization is not always synonymous with justice. And yet, through all the flaws and triumphs, Mesopotamia gave us a model. A prototype. A beginning. The human capacity for creativity, order, ambition, and reflection, all are present in those early cities of clay and reed. They did not have all the answers, but they asked the right questions. And in doing so, they lit a torch that has never gone out. Their torch, though kindled in distant antiquity, still casts light on the paths we walk today. In education, the Mesopotamians laid the groundwork for formal learning. Scribes, trained in the adubas, tablet houses, spent years mastering cuneiform. They copied proverbs, solved mathematical exercises, and memorized legal formulas. This was not merely rote instruction, it was a gateway to power and prestige. To write was to command knowledge, to preserve memory, to speak across time. And what they wrote reveals a startling familiarity. Letters between merchants speak of delayed shipments and lost cargo. Legal disputes address inheritance, divorce, theft, and debt. Parental advice pleads for obedience and diligence. In their words, the ancient Mesopotamians become not strangers, but neighbors, people who loved, feared, worked, and wondered much like we do. Religion remained at the center of public and private life. Every city had a patron deity, whose temple was the heart of both spiritual and economic life. Temples employed thousands, managed land holdings, and controlled trade routes. Priests interpreted omens, offered sacrifices, and presided over rituals that marked the changing seasons. The divine was not confined to the heavens, it dwelled in every aspect of the world, from the stars to the river's flow. And yet, for all their reverence of the gods, the Mesopotamians also struggled with divine silence. The dialogue of pessimism captures a striking existential doubt, as a servant and master debate every course of action, only to conclude each time that all is meaningless. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero confronts death, laments his mortal limits, and seeks eternal life, only to find that even kings must die. These are not merely stories of one ancient land. They are echoes of a universal human experience. In architecture, they gave the world the arch and the vault. They built cities with planned streets and drainage systems. Their use of sun-dried brick may seem primitive, yet many of their structures stood for centuries, testifying to their ingenuity and adaptation to a harsh environment. Their economy, rooted in agriculture, expanded to include long-distance trade in precious metals, timber, and luxury goods. Mesopotamian merchants sailed the Persian Gulf, crossed the Syrian steppe, and navigated the mountains of Anatolia. In doing so, they not only exchanged goods, but ideas, customs, and languages. They were among the first to forge a global web of human connection. Their libraries, like that of Nineveh, preserved myths and mathematics side by side, reminding us that the search for truth, whether through story or science, has always been intertwined. Their scribes recorded eclipses and omens with equal care. For them, the cosmos was both ordered and mysterious, a mirror of the human soul. And what of the people themselves? Their names, Shulgi, Enheduanna, Sargon, Nabonidus, still linger, like footprints in clay. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, was not only a high priestess but the world's first known author by name. Her hymns to Inanna are lyrical, powerful, and deeply personal, a testament to a woman's voice speaking across the ages. As we turn the page of history, we do not close the book of Mesopotamia. We carry it with us. Its lessons, all of innovation and fragility, of ambition and humility, are ever relevant. It reminds us that progress does not flow in one direction, that even the most advanced societies can falter, and that memory is both a burden and a gift. Mesopotamia may have been born of mud and reed, but it reached for the stars. And in doing so, it gave us not only the shape of cities, but the shape of our dreams. Through its dreams, etched in clay, echoed in stone, Mesopotamia offered the world a vision of what it means to be human in an organized society. It did not simply create the city, it imagined the role of the citizen, the ruler, the priest, the worker, and the sage. From this vision arose not only monuments and myths, but ethics. Justice, however imperfectly applied, became a public concern. The Code of Hammurabi, though harsh by modern standards, placed the law above the ruler. It recognized that actions required accountability. That the strong, at least in principle, owed protection to the weak. This balance, between authority and responsibility, tradition and innovation, individual and community, remained central to every civilization that followed. And Mesopotamia was the first to attempt it on such a scale. In their daily lives, we see a society constantly evolving. Artisans crafted intricate jewelry and statuary, their styles shifting with each dynasty. Musicians composed hymns and lamentations, played on harps and lyres, that gave voice to joy and sorrow. Farmers experimented with irrigation, adjusting to the ever-shifting waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Children played with toys fashioned from clay, miniature chariots, dolls, and animals. Families shared meals of bread, dates, and beer. They lived in homes of mud brick, cooled by courtyards and shaded walls. In these small, quiet details, the grandeur of empires gives way to something even more profound, the simple dignity of life. And while kings inscribed their victories on stelae, and priests gazed at the stars for signs, the people built their world day by day, with their hands, their voices, and their hopes. Mesopotamia was not frozen in myth. It was lived and breathed by generations who knew nothing of being first or founders, but who planted the seeds from which civilization grew. That is why, when we speak of Mesopotamia, we do not merely recount facts. We reawaken something timeless. We remember that all our buildings, all our books, all our beliefs, have roots that run deep into that ancient soil. And so we listen, across the gulf of centuries, to the clay tablets as they whisper their truths. We remember that once, between two rivers, a people stood up from the earth, looked at the sky, and began to write. And what they wrote, those humble strokes pressed into wet clay, became humanity's first sustained conversation with itself. They wrote to keep accounts, yes, to record grain deliveries, labor assignments, temple inventories. But soon, they wrote to reflect, to argue, to dream. Contracts gave way to prayers. Ledgers gave rise to lamentations. Bureaucracy yielded to beauty. Through cuneiform, the first voices of literature emerged. The Epic of Gilgamesh did not merely glorify a king's deeds, it explored mortality, friendship, and the limits of human power. It asked what it means to live well, to lose deeply, to face the certainty of death and still find purpose. Such questions, so ancient and yet so familiar, prove that Mesopotamia's greatest achievement was not its engineering or conquests. It was self-awareness, the realization that we are finite beings in an infinite cosmos, seeking meaning in the time we are given. That awareness is what links us to them. For in the ruins of Ur and Lagash, in the broken ziggurats and sunbaked tablets, we do not find a foreign world, we find ourselves, at the beginning. Their story is not one of inevitability. Mesopotamia rose and fell many times. Floods destroyed fields. Invasions toppled kings. Climate shifts left cities abandoned. The land that had once teemed with wheat and song fell silent more than once. Yet it was always rebuilt. Why? Because the idea of civilization had taken root. Because once people saw what was possible, cooperation, learning, memory, they could not unsee it. They could not return to lives scattered and forgotten. The city had entered the soul. And so, long after Mesopotamia ceased to be a political power, it remained a cultural one. Its language shaped others. Its myths were retold. Its methods were copied. Its ruins inspired awe in every generation that stumbled upon their mounds and stones. Even today, archaeologists continue to dig. New discoveries emerge, tiny figurines, temple inscriptions, ancient recipes. Each one a whisper from the past, reminding us that there is still more to learn, more to feel, more to remember. And so the story continues, carried not just in books or museums, but in the very structure of our thought. For the true measure of a civilization is not how long its walls stand, but how long its wisdom lives. Mesopotamia lives still. Mesopotamia lives still, not just in the artifacts uncovered from the earth, but in the questions we continue to ask. How shall we govern? They asked this through councils and kings, through laws etched in stone. How shall we measure and record? They answered with numbers based on 60, with tablets baked for permanence. How shall we speak to the divine, and how shall we live with each other? They built temples as bridges to the heavens, and wrote hymns of longing, anger, and praise. Their questions are our own. We see their influence in every corner of the modern world. The division of time into hours and minutes. The mapping of the sky into constellations. The idea that a city is a place of trade, worship, record, and law. The belief that memory can be preserved, and must be. And beyond all that, there remains something more intangible, yet no less vital, the spirit of inquiry. The refusal to accept silence where there could be understanding. The drive to interpret signs, to document thoughts, to shape clay into symbols that endure. This is why Mesopotamia matters. Not because it was the first, though it was. Not because it was powerful, though it was. But because in its rise and fall, its glory and grief, it offered a mirror to all who would follow, a mirror in which we see our own hopes and flaws, our cycles of creation and collapse, and our yearning to be remembered. In this way, Mesopotamia did not vanish. It dispersed. Into Babylon and Byzantium, into Baghdad and beyond. Into our words, our structures, our dreams. It taught us that the written word could endure longer than any stone. That laws could outlast kings. That knowledge, once shared, becomes immortal. And so the cities fell, but civilization stood. Between two rivers, the human story found its first chapters. And we are still turning the pages. And as we turn those pages, we begin to understand that Mesopotamia was not simply a place, it was a process. A process of shaping order from chaos. Of gathering people under shared ideas, rules, and stories. Of building not just walls and markets, but memory. This process was slow, imperfect, and often marked by suffering. There were famines and floods. There were wars and unjust rulers. There were mistakes carved into clay for all to see. But there was also resilience. Adaptation. A constant striving toward something greater than mere survival. We see that spirit in the way they faced their environment. The rivers that nourished their fields could just as easily destroy them. Yet they did not retreat, they engineered. They built canals, dikes, and reservoirs, working with nature rather than surrendering to it. Their mastery of water was not just technical, it was cultural. It shaped how they saw time, labor, and divine will. We see it in their language. Cuneiform evolved over centuries, becoming more precise, more expressive. From lists to letters, from contracts to cosmologies, it became a medium of thought itself. That a symbol pressed into clay could hold meaning across generations was not only a technological leap, but a philosophical one. It meant that ideas could endure beyond death. And we see it in their art. In the lion hunts of Assyrian kings. In the votive statues of humble worshippers. In the carved seals that bore the marks of identity and intent. These were not just decorations, they were declarations. Messages sent into time, saying, I was here. I believed. I built. I mattered. This is perhaps Mesopotamia's deepest legacy, the sense that to be human is to leave a trace. to shape clay into meaning, to order the stars into stories, to find, amidst the uncertainty of life, something worth preserving. And in that act of preservation, we become linked, not only to each other but to those who came before. Every document we write, every structure we raise, every story we tell is part of that unbroken thread. It began between two rivers, where people first imagined that their lives could be more than fleeting. It continues with us. So the legacy of Mesopotamia endures, not in monuments alone, but in the very structure of how we live and think. In every library, where knowledge is stored for future generations, there is an echo of Ashurbanipal's grand collection in Nineveh. In every courtroom where law is applied and recorded, there is the shadow of Hammurabi's stele. In every classroom where a child learns to read and write, we hear the voices of Sumerian scribes repeating their lessons on clay. But perhaps most profoundly, Mesopotamia teaches us humility. For all its brilliance, its cities fell. Its languages faded. Its temples crumbled into dust. Its mighty kings, who once claimed dominion over the world, are now known only through fragments and inscriptions. No power, however great, is eternal. And yet, the memory remained. It remained because people chose to remember. They dug into the soil. They puzzled over strange symbols. They asked, who were these people? What did they believe? What did they leave behind? And in doing so, they brought Mesopotamia back into the human story. This act of remembering is itself part of the legacy. It tells us that what we do matters, that the records we keep, the buildings we raise, the questions we ask, will shape how we are remembered. It tells us that civilization is not a finished product, but an ongoing work, built by hands and hearts across millennia. It tells us that the flame which first flickered along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates still burns. In the end, Mesopotamia is not just history, it is inheritance. It is the inheritance of all who write, who wonder, who build, and who believe that memory has meaning. From clay to code, from stars to satellites, we are still part of the same long journey. It began there, between the rivers. And it continues here, with us. Echoes through the ages, Mesopotamia's influence on the world. Long after the ziggurats fell silent and the scribes laid down their styluses, the spirit of Mesopotamia rippled outward, subtle yet indelible. It became a thread woven into the fabric of civilizations yet unborn, influencing cultures far beyond the boundaries of its floodplains. The Hebrews, wandering out of Ur, carried with them not only the memory of a land but the seeds of monotheism, a concept that would later shape the great Abrahamic faiths. In the ancient laws of Israel, one can sense the distant echo of Hammurabi's code, where justice was not the whim of rulers, but a standard written for all to see. The Greeks, who prided themselves on their reason and philosophy, borrowed far more from the East than they admitted. Their astronomical systems drew from the meticulous sky-watching of Babylonian priests. Their mathematical notions, though refined in Hellenic thought, stood upon the foundations laid by Sumerian and Akkadian scholars. The Romans, builders of empires, found in Mesopotamia a model of administration and law. Their civic records, tax systems, and codified statutes owe something to the scribes who once tallied harvests in Lagash or compiled legal cases in Sippar. Even in Islamic Golden Age Baghdad, rising near the bones of Ctesiphon, scholars translated and preserved Mesopotamian science. They studied ancient treatises on medicine, astronomy, and timekeeping. They calculated, refined, preserved. The House of Wisdom, in many ways, was a descendant of temple libraries like those at Nippur and Uruk. In the Renaissance, when Europe awoke to the value of ancient texts, it looked again toward the East. Though Mesopotamia's name was often forgotten, its methods were not. Historians, scientists, and architects built unknowingly upon its designs, echoing principles first tested in the shadow of the ziggurat. Even now, in the digital age, when tablets are made not of clay but of light and glass, the ancient urge remains, to record, to remember, to reason. Our spreadsheets, our laws, our literature, all carry traces of those who first dared to write their world into permanence. The rivers have changed course. The cities are buried. But the current flows on. To walk through the ruins of Mesopotamia is to tread upon memory itself. Here, beneath the sands, lie broken thresholds once passed by priests in solemn procession. Here, under collapsed bricks, are the remnants of markets once vibrant with trade. And somewhere beneath each mound, called etched by archaeologists, there are stories yet unread, still sealed in clay. But it is not only in ruins that Mesopotamia survives. It lives in the scholars who decipher signs no one had read for thousands of years. In the conservators who brush away dust with reverent care. In the teachers who introduce students to a place where writing was born. It lives, too, in modern languages. Words like cylinder, sickle, and shekel trace linguistic roots back to Akkadian and Sumerian terms. The idea of zero, the use of geometry in measuring fields, the classification of diseases, all have ancestral echoes in this ancient world. In Mesopotamian religion, too, we find early visions of divine justice and cosmic order. Their pantheon, while now silent, laid the psychological groundwork for later theologies. Their gods were not distant abstractions, they were personalities, forces of nature and society given voice and face. And in those early epics, we glimpse the first attempts to reconcile what it means to be mortal. What you seek, you shall never find. For when the gods created man, they kept immortality for themselves. The Epic of Gilgamesh. This passage, ancient, yet eternally fresh, speaks not only to Mesopotamians, but to all who wrestle with purpose and loss. It reminds us that our ancestors were not shadows, but souls. That they, too, feared death. That they, too, searched for meaning. Mesopotamia offers no easy answers. But it gives us a place to begin asking. And in doing so, it becomes not merely a subject of study, but a companion, a voice that speaks from the depths of time, inviting us to remember, to question, and to carry forward the legacy of those who first imagined what it meant to be a civilization. In time, the mighty kings who once ruled Mesopotamia became only names, some remembered in chronicles, others lost to the silence of time. The grandeur of their palaces faded. Their treasures were looted, their cities swallowed by dust and grass. And yet, their words remained. Not the boasts of victory alone, but the quiet records, the merchant's ledger, a farmer's plea, a schoolboy's clumsy exercise. These humble artifacts tell the truest tale, not of empires, but of people. People who feared drought and dreamed of wealth. Who mourned their dead and honored their gods. Who made promises, kept accounts, raised children, and worried about the future. It is in these moments, small, domestic, human, that the ancient world speaks most clearly. We see a father arranging a marriage for his daughter. A widow petitioning for her rights. A worker receiving payment in beer. These lives were once as real as ours, unseen until clay, by miracle and effort, made them visible again. That is the power of writing. Not to glorify, but to preserve. Not to dominate, but to connect. In Mesopotamia, humanity first entrusted its memory to symbols, symbols shaped by hand, hardened by fire, and carried across centuries to us. And now, as custodians of that memory, we must ask ourselves, what will we pass on? If Mesopotamia teaches anything, it is that legacy is not made by conquest alone. It is made by care, by the preservation of thought, by the humility to record even the mundane, trusting that someday it may matter. The Mesopotamians could not have known we would read their words. They wrote not for us, but for their gods, their kings, their heirs. And yet, through their diligence, we are granted a window into the first pages of human thought. That window remains open. And through it, across 4,000 years of silence, they still speak. In the end, the greatest legacy of Mesopotamia is not what they built, but what they remembered. For when they pressed symbols into clay, they did more than record, they created a world where time could be tamed, where thought could be held. A world where what was said could be saved, where what was done could be judged. A world of continuity. This act, so simple, so profound, gave rise to history itself. Before writing, the past was passed by voice alone, fragile as wind. With cuneiform, memory found form. The deeds of kings, the laws of cities, the rituals of the temple, all were made solid. Even more, the voices of the forgotten, the shopkeeper, the brewer, the shepherd, were given weight. Through records, they too stepped into history. And we, standing in the present, are their inheritors. Every time we write, we continue what they began. Every signature, every list, every inscription is part of that ancient vow, that the human experience is worth preserving. That our joys and sufferings are not lost if they are recorded. This is why we still tell their stories. Why we uncover their cities and trace the paths of their canals. Why we study their symbols, sing their hymns, ponder their questions. Not for nostalgia, but for guidance. Because Mesopotamia, in its rise and fall, teaches us how civilizations are made, not by accident, but by attention. By the slow, patient weaving of lives into a shared structure. By water drawn, walls raised, grain measured, gods honored. By the idea that we are stronger when we remember. And so, the dust of their temples now lies beneath our foundations. Their voices echo in the libraries of today. Their questions haunt our silence and enrich our speech. They are not gone. They are within us. As the sun set each day over ancient Mesopotamia, it cast long shadows across the canals, the rooftops, the towering ziggurats. And in those golden moments, a stillness fell, a pause between toil and rest, between day and night. It was in that quiet space, perhaps, that a people first conceived of the eternal, of time that moved not just forward, but deep. They looked to the stars and saw stories. They looked to the earth and saw order. They looked to one another and saw the need to remember. That is the root of civilization. Not walls or wealth, but shared memory. A belief that we are part of something larger than ourselves. Mesopotamia gave this to the world, not perfectly, not without cost, but undeniably. It gave the tools to measure land and justice, the means to mark a contract, to record a birth, to mourn the dead with words that lasted. It gave humanity a way to see itself, again and again, across time. Now, those rivers still run, though altered. The ruins still stand, though weathered. And the clay tablets, once hidden beneath centuries of dust, now rest in glass cases, speaking silently to all who pass. They say, "We were here. We lived. We loved. We labored. We believed." And they ask, "What will you remember?" Between the rivers, humanity first found its voice. And through that voice, fragile, enduring, bold, we still speak. The lives within the walls, daily life in Mesopotamia. Beyond kings and conquests, temples and tablets, there was life, ordinary, vibrant, and deeply human. For the true measure of any civilization is not found only in its monuments, but in the quiet rhythm of daily existence. In Mesopotamia, this life was shaped by the rivers, the sun, the seasons, and the ever-turning wheel of labor. At dawn, the city awoke to sound, the bray of donkeys, the splash of water drawn from wells, the murmur of voices rising in the markets. The streets, narrow and winding, soon filled with merchants setting out their wares, baskets of dates, bundles of reeds, jars of oil, bolts of cloth. Artisans worked in open courtyards, hammering copper, shaping pottery, carving cylinder seals that bore the marks of identity. Houses of the wealthy were built of mud brick, with flat roofs and interior courtyards that offered privacy and shade. Their walls were plastered smooth, sometimes painted with simple designs. The poor lived in more modest dwellings, 1 or 2 rooms shared by families, clustered along the city's edge. Food was simple and hearty. Barley was the staple grain, ground into flour for bread or fermented into beer. Lentils, onions, garlic, and cucumbers added variety. Fish came from the rivers, mutton and goat from nearby fields. Cooking was done over clay hearths, and meals were eaten with the fingers or from shared bowls. Families were central. The father held legal authority, the mother managed the household. Children, from an early age, learned their roles. Boys might become scribes, merchants, or craftsmen. Girls often married young and managed homes of their own. Education, while limited to the elite, was rigorous for those who entered it. The scribe schools demanded discipline, repetition, and long hours copying texts. Religion was ever present. Small household altars honored the gods. Festivals marked the turning of seasons, rituals to ensure fertility, protection, or victory. Priests and priestesses played vital roles, not just in temples, but in interpreting omens, administering property, and guiding community life. Outside the city, farmers worked from dawn until dusk, tending wheat fields, herding sheep, and maintaining irrigation canals. Their labor fed the cities, and in return, they paid taxes, sometimes in grain, sometimes in labor. And beneath it all, the pulse of time moved steadily. The seasons changed. Kings came and went. But life, humble and enduring, carried on. The city-states of Mesopotamia, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, and others, were more than places of stone and mortar. They were living organisms, woven together by shared labor, belief, and custom. Within their walls, every task had meaning, and every life a role to play in the grand design. labor was not a punishment, but a necessity, respected and rewarded. Farmers maintained the lifelines of the land, the canals and levees that tamed the river's flow. Without them, there would be no grain, no bread, no beer. Artisans supplied the tools and adornments of civilization: blades, bricks, combs, jewelry, and figurines. Each item carried both function and beauty. Scribes were the elite of knowledge. With stylus in hand, they recorded transactions, histories, myths, and omens. To be a scribe was to be the memory of the city. Apprentices began young, practicing on discarded shards of clay, repeating symbols until their hands knew them by heart. The scribal schools were strict, demanding, and proud. Merchants traveled far beyond the city walls, through deserts and across rivers, bearing copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Their caravans moved along ancient trade routes that stretched toward the distant horizon. In their hands, not only goods but ideas flowed. Faith united all. Every person, from king to commoner, lived within a divine order. The gods were many, each city had its patron, each occupation its protector. Temples dominated the skyline, but their reach was more than symbolic. They were banks, employers, granaries, and courts. In times of drought, the people prayed for rain; in times of war, for victory. Festivals offered relief from labor and a renewal of community bonds. There were processions with music and incense, sacrifices and offerings, dances and feasts. The New Year's festival in Babylon was especially grand, a time when the king humbled himself before the gods, acknowledging that his power was not his own. Marriage was both sacred and social. Contracts were drawn up, dowries exchanged, rituals performed. Though love played a role, it was duty, between families, to the community, that shaped the bond. Women could own property, manage estates, and even serve in temple offices, though their freedoms varied by region and time. Death, too, was part of the cycle. The Mesopotamians believed in an underworld, not of torment, but of shadow. The dead were remembered through offerings and prayers. Tombs held amulets, tools, and texts to guide the soul. Life was brief, uncertain, but memory was eternal. Through all of this, the people of Mesopotamia lived not as distant figures in a lost world, but as our ancestors, tired at day's end, joyful at a child's laugh, sorrowful in loss, hopeful at the harvest. Their hands shaped clay, their voices shaped myth, their lives shaped civilization. And in that they live on. In Mesopotamia, time was not merely counted, it was lived in cycles, sacred and practical, shaped by sun and star, by flood and field. The year began with Akitu, the New Year festival, a time of deep ritual and renewal. It was not only the turning of the calendar, but the recreation of cosmic order. The king, symbol of worldly rule, was ritually stripped of his regalia and humbled before Marduk. Only by acknowledging his human frailty could he be restored as sovereign. It was a moment of drama and reverence, a reminder that power must serve divine order, not itself. Each month carried its own tasks, its own signs. The rising of the star Sirius marked the coming of the harvest. The darkening moon signaled times of caution. The priests, skilled in observation, kept watch over the heavens, not as curiosity, but as necessity. For in the stars, they believed, was written the will of the gods. Calendars were not abstract charts. They were tools of survival. They told when to plant barley, when to clean the canals, when to hold festivals, when to mourn. They organized work and worship alike. And because they were precise, based on both lunar and solar movement, they allowed the people to live in step with the world around them. This harmony extended into architecture. Temples and ziggurats were not placed at random, they aligned with cardinal points, designed to capture light and shadow at sacred times. The builders, guided by astronomy and tradition, shaped space as a reflection of cosmic order. Even writing had rhythm. The act of impressing a stylus into wet clay had tempo and technique, like a song sung with fingers. The repetition of characters was a kind of liturgy, a daily devotion to order, clarity, and permanence. And so, the daily life of Mesopotamia unfolded within these great cycles, of sun and moon, of seed and harvest, of birth and death. It gave the people not only structure, but meaning, a sense that their toil and joy, their fear and hope, were all part of a vast and eternal story. To live in Mesopotamia was to know that time itself was sacred. Not as a prison, but as a pattern. Not as something to escape, but something to honor. A pattern we still follow, often unaware. For all its utility, Mesopotamian life was not without art, indeed, it flourished with expression. Beauty was not an afterthought but a vital part of being. In temples and homes, in public spaces and private belongings, the people adorned their world with symbols of meaning, strength, and grace. Their sculpture told stories not only of gods and kings, but of worshippers, lions, and spirits. Statues were crafted with stylized eyes, wide and attentive, as if forever watching the world. These figures, often small, portable, intimate, were not merely decorative. They were intercessors, prayers made solid. They stood in temples long after their patrons were gone, continuing the offering of presents. Bas-reliefs, carved in alabaster and stone, adorned the palace walls of Assyrian kings. In these grand panels, one sees the lion hunt of Ashurnasirpal, the processions of servants and soldiers, the towering winged bulls called Lamassu, guardians of threshold and kingdom. These works blended realism and symbolism, capturing power in motion and divinity in form. Even the most functional items bore beauty. Cylinder seals, used to mark documents, were engraved with mythological scenes, beasts in combat, divine rituals. Rolled across wet clay, they left behind a miniature epic. Jewelry, too, bore symbols of protection and faith, rosettes, crescents, stars. Each item was both adornment and amulet. Music accompanied ritual and rejoicing. Though few instruments survive, we know from texts of lyres and harps, of pipes and drums. Songs were sung for gods, for victory, for mourning. A famous artifact from yore, the so-called Queen's Lyre, depicts a bull-headed instrument adorned with inlaid scenes of feasting and fantasy. It reminds us that where there is voice, there is song. Painting, though less preserved, adorned temple walls and pottery. Bright pigments from minerals and plants brought life to carvings and murals. Color, like form, held symbolic weight, lapis blue for divinity, red for vitality, white for purity. And within all this, sculpture, seal, song, and stone lay the unmistakable mark of a people who saw the world as a place of meaning, where nothing was too small to honor, and no space too humble to hold beauty. In their art, as in their writing, the people of Mesopotamia reached for something beyond the visible. they tried to make spirit tangible, to bind the fleeting moment with the eternal. And in doing so, they left not only images, but imprints of soul. Amid the towering ziggurats and royal inscriptions, the pulse of Mesopotamian society beat strongest within the family. At the heart of daily life stood the household, a small, ordered realm where love, duty, and survival wove together in quiet constancy. The roles within this realm were distinct, yet intertwined. The father, legally responsible for the household, managed land, livestock, and trade. But the mother's role was no less vital. She oversaw the running of the home, the raising of children, and, in many cases, managed servants and estates. In merchant families, women sometimes conducted business in the absence of their husbands, signing contracts and maintaining ledgers. Women could inherit property and even engage in legal transactions, though their rights depended heavily on their social status and the particular era. In Sumer, early priestesses held positions of great influence, both spiritual and economic. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, was not only high priestess of the moon god Nanna but also the world's earliest known author. Her hymns, rich in devotion and poetic depth, still echo with the voice of a powerful woman speaking across millennia. Marriage was both a personal and economic institution. Contracts detailed dowries and expectations. Divorce was permitted, and legal records show cases brought by wives over neglect or abuse. Children were central to family continuity. Sons carried on the name and inheritance, while daughters often married to forge alliances or secure stability. The extended family acted as a protective net. Aunts, uncles, and cousins shared responsibilities and burdens. Elders were respected, their wisdom sought in matters of land, law, and lineage. At the margins of society lived those who were enslaved or impoverished, often prisoners of war, debtors, or those born into bondage. Their lives were hard, though not devoid of legal protection. Some could own property, marry, or even buy their freedom. Above all, Mesopotamian society was interwoven. Each person, no matter how humble, was part of the great structure, temple, city, kingdom. And within that structure, relationships mattered, between man and woman, parent and child, citizen and stranger, mortal and god. These bonds, forged in the heat of daily life, held the world together far more firmly than any wall or army. And through them, even now, we may glimpse the enduring heart of an ancient people. Among the most lasting legacies of Mesopotamia was its conception of law. For here, amid the dust and brick, humanity first dared to set down right and wrong, not as fleeting custom, but as written decree. Justice, once the domain of tribal leaders or divine whim, became something recorded, debated, and applied. The most famous of these laws is the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a black basalt stele around 1750 BCE and set upright in the public square. At its top, Hammurabi is depicted receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, a divine source for earthly rule. The message was clear: the law was not invention, but revelation. The code itself spans nearly 300 laws, covering everything from theft and trade to marriage, inheritance, and injury. The punishments vary, often harsh by modern standards, but rooted in the principle of balance, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye. Yet the code also reveals a complex society, concerned with accountability, property rights, and the protection of the weak. There are provisions for orphans and widows, for escaped slaves and damaged property. There are fines for negligence, remedies for breach of contract, and rules for adoption. The law was not merely for rulers, it reached into kitchens and workshops, into fields and temples. Other cities and dynasties issued their own codes, earlier ones in Sumer, later revisions in Assyria. Together, they formed a living tradition, one that saw justice not as a fixed ideal, but as a living practice. Judges were appointed, courts convened, oaths sworn before gods. Evidence mattered. Testimony could acquit or condemn. And alongside legal documents, we find personal letters, pleas for fairness, complaints against corruption, requests for intervention. These voices remind us that law was not only a system, but a hope. The hope that power could be restrained, that wrongs could be righted, that peace could be maintained through principle, not fear. Mesopotamian justice was not perfect. Inequality persisted. Punishments were unequal across class and gender. But the idea that law could shape life, that order was preferable to chaos, was a gift of profound importance. And in every courtroom, every contract, every constitution written since, that ancient idea lives on. In Mesopotamia, knowledge was not divided into the secular and the sacred. It was all one stream, flowing from the gods, observed in the world, and recorded by the scribes. Whether charting the heavens or diagnosing illness, the Mesopotamians believed they were uncovering the divine logic that governed all things. Astronomy was among their most advanced sciences. From the rooftops of temples, priests watched the night sky, recording the movements of stars, planets, and the moon. These observations were precise, meticulous, and often recorded over centuries. They used star charts, lunar calendars, and even early forms of ephemerides, timetables predicting celestial events. Why this focus on the stars? Because they believed the heavens mirrored fate. Eclipses foretold danger. The appearance of Venus signaled war or peace. Conjunctions of planets might herald a king's death or a harvest's failure. This was not mere superstition, it was a structured form of knowledge, built on observation, reflection, and interpretation. In medicine, too, the Mesopotamians left behind texts both practical and mystical. Clay tablets list hundreds of remedies, salves for wounds, potions for fever, incantations for mental distress. They recognized the liver as central to life and used models of it in divination. Diagnosis combined physical signs with spiritual inquiry. Was the illness caused by a spirit, a sin, or a natural cause? Mathematics served the needs of trade, engineering, and astronomy. The sexagesimal, base 60, system they developed underpins our 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle. They calculated areas of fields, volumes of bricks, and interest on loans. Multiplication tables, geometry problems, and algebraic exercises survive in abundance. Engineering knowledge shaped their cities. Canals were planned with an understanding of flow and gradient. Ziggurats stood on solid foundations, often with interior drains and heat management features. Builders used standardized bricks and even left behind instruction manuals, ancient blueprints in clay. And at the center of all this knowledge stood the scribes, those patient minds who recorded, copied, and taught. Their work was not invention in the modern sense, but reverent transmission. They saw themselves as guardians of truth, handed down from the gods. From their hands came the first glimmers of systematic thought. the first steps toward science. Theirs was a world in which observation and devotion walked side by side, where numbers were sacred, where signs in the sky were read like holy text. And in that harmony of knowledge and wonder, Mesopotamia once again shines, not just as the beginning of civilization, but as its mind. To the people of Mesopotamia, the world was alive with unseen power. The wind was not merely air, it was the breath of Enlil. The river's bounty and fury flowed from the hands of Enki. The morning star that glowed at dawn? It was Inanna, fierce and radiant, moving through the sky. Religion was not a part of life, it was the essence of life. Every act, from farming to warfare, from childbirth to kingship, was understood within the framework of divine will. The gods were many, each with their domains, personalities, and symbols. And their presence was not distant, it was immediate, present in flame and flood, in dream and omen. At the head of the pantheon stood An, the sky god, father of the divine order. Enlil, lord of air and destiny, ruled from the sacred city of Nippur. Enki, god of wisdom and water, dwelled in the sweet depths of the Abzu, a cosmic ocean beneath the earth. Ninhursag, the Earth Mother, gave form to life. And Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was goddess of love, war, and the planet Venus, unpredictable and powerful. These gods were worshipped not just in temples, but in every corner of daily life. Offerings of incense, food, and song were made with devotion. Festivals reenacted the great myths, bringing cosmic drama into the streets. The ziggurat, towering over each city, was both a monument and a cosmic bridge, connecting earth with heaven, mortal with divine. Myth gave meaning to the unknown. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, the universe begins in chaos, Tiamat, the salt sea, and Apsu, the sweet water, mingling in the void. From their union came the gods. From their conflict, the world. When Marduk, champion of the younger gods, defeats Tiamat and splits her body in two, the heavens and earth are formed. From her eyes flow the Tigris and Euphrates. This tale, like all Mesopotamian myth, blends wonder and order, violence and structure. The gods are not abstract, they are driven by emotion, ambition, and need. They mirror the human world, and through that mirroring, make it understandable. The descent of Inanna tells of the goddess entering the underworld, stripped of her power, facing death, and returning transformed. It is a story of suffering and rebirth, of darkness that does not last forever. Such stories were not just entertainment, they were rituals, reenacted by priests and communities, guiding the soul through the cycles of life and loss. And in the great epic of Gilgamesh, we find perhaps the most profound religious meditation of the ancient world. A king, part divine yet fully mortal, seeks immortality. He fails. And in that failure, learns the wisdom of acceptance, the power of friendship, the beauty of fleeting life, the comfort of a legacy left behind. In Mesopotamian religion, the divine was not a promise of paradise, but a framework for meaning. It taught that life was fragile, yet sacred. That the gods were powerful, yet needed care. That to live well was to honor the rhythm of the cosmos. And in that rhythm, they found peace. Though life in Mesopotamia was shaped by rivers and ritual, it was also forged by power. City-states became kingdoms. Kingdoms became empires. And with each step, the scale of ambition grew, not only in conquest, but in organization, law, art, and memory. The earliest rulers, like the kings of Uruk and Lagash, saw themselves as stewards of divine will. Their titles were modest, ensi, meaning governor or shepherd. But with the rise of Sargon of Akkad in the 24th century BCE, a new vision emerged. Sargon did not rule just one city. He united many, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and called himself king of the four quarters of the world. His Akkadian empire, though short-lived, marked a turning point. Centralized administration. Appointed governors. A standing army. Roads for swift communication. And a new language, Akkadian, that would become the region's lingua franca for over a millennium. Following Sargon came the rise of the third dynasty of Ur, often called the Sumerian Renaissance. Under Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, the cities flourished. Law codes were issued. Ziggurats were built anew. Trade expanded. Bureaucracy deepened. The king became not just a warrior, but a builder, a priest, and a god's earthly partner. In the north, Assyria grew, first as a trade hub, then as a military power. Its kings, fierce and disciplined, carved an empire with iron and fear. Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, and Ashurbanipal extended their reach over Babylon, Syria, and even Egypt. They left behind libraries, palaces, and policies, strict, effective, and often ruthless. Yet it was Babylon, under Hammurabi and later Nebuchadnezzar II, that captured the imagination of history. Babylon was more than a city, it was a symbol. Of order, of grandeur, of divine favor. Its gates, its gardens, its temples, the very word Babylon became synonymous with wealth and mystery. These empires rose and fell in cycles, conquest, consolidation, collapse. But each added layers to Mesopotamian civilization. They refined administration, expanded literacy, and integrated diverse peoples into shared systems. And always, they recorded victory stele, administrative ledgers, royal edicts, omens and dreams. Even their defeats were carved in stone, for it was not only power that these kings sought, but permanence. They knew what the rivers taught, nothing lasts forever. And so, they wrote. Every civilization has its dusk, and Mesopotamia was no exception. As the centuries passed, the brilliance that had once lit the floodplains of Sumer and Akkad began to fade, not all at once, but slowly, like embers dying in the hearth. The reasons were many. The rivers that once gave life also brought destruction. Floods altered their course. Salt crept into the soil from over-irrigation, diminishing the fertility of the land. Cities that had thrived on barley and date palms began to shrink, their foundations cracked by time and water alike. Invasion followed. The Hittites came from Anatolia, the Kassites from the Zagros. Later, the Chaldeans and Medes, the Persians under Cyrus the Great. Each wave brought change, new rulers, new gods, new laws. Babylon, though often spared destruction, became a jewel passed from hand to hand. By the 6th century BCE, Mesopotamia was absorbed into the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The ziggurats still stood, the temples still functioned, but the language of power had changed. Cuneiform was gradually replaced by Aramaic, and with it, the scribal schools began to wane. The Seleucid Greeks followed the Persians, then the Parthians, and finally the Sasanians. With each new ruler, the customs of old Mesopotamia blended with Hellenistic, Iranian, and Semitic traditions. The gods of Sumer became memories. The libraries fell into disuse. The clay tablets, once copied with care, were no longer read. By the time of the Arab conquests in the 7th century CE, the ancient cities lay buried beneath their own rubble. Baghdad would rise nearby, glorious in its own right, but it was a new world now. The voices of Enheduanna, of Hammurabi, of Gilgamesh, were silent. Or so it seemed. For even in silence, Mesopotamia endured. Its science and symbols filtered into the Islamic Golden Age. Its myths echoed in the Hebrew Bible, in Greek legends, in Quranic stories. Its methods of rule and writing, of measuring and managing, passed down through unseen hands. And then, centuries later, the earth gave up its secrets. Archaeologists uncovered Nineveh, Ur, Lagash. Tablets were found in the thousands. The cuneiform script, once a mystery, was deciphered. And once more, Mesopotamia spoke, not in prophecy, but in memory. The twilight had not been an end, but a transformation. A quiet folding into the greater story of humanity. The rivers still flow. The clay still speaks. And the cradle of civilization still rocks us, gently, silently, as we dream of where we came from. For over 1,000 years, Mesopotamia lay silent beneath layers of earth and legend. Her cities became nameless mounds. Her kings, mythic shadows. Her language, forgotten, its wedge-shaped script mute to every living tongue. And yet, the world never fully let go. Travelers wandered the ruins. Biblical texts spoke of Babylon, of Ur, of a tower reaching toward heaven. Ancient Greeks told of Semiramis and hanging gardens. But these were fragments, half-truths wrapped in wonder. It was not until the 19th century, amid Europe's growing fascination with the ancient world, that Mesopotamia began to awaken once more. Adventurers, diplomats, and scholars, men like Austin Henry Laird, Hormuzd Raz Sam, and Paul Emile Botta, journeyed into the Ottoman-controlled lands of modern Iraq and Syria. What they found astounded them: winged bulls buried in sand, palace reliefs beneath villages, and tablets by the thousand, inscribed in a language no one yet understood. These were the cities of Nineveh and Nimrud, of Babylon and Ur. With shovels and brushes, the earth was peeled back to reveal palaces, temples, libraries. And with them, a lost world returned. The decipherment of cuneiform began slowly. It was a puzzle of remarkable difficulty, 3 scripts, dozens of signs, and thousands of years of evolution. Yet by the mid-19th century, scholars like Henry Rawlinson had cracked enough of the code to read royal inscriptions and historical records. The Epic of Gilgamesh was unearthed, and for the first time in over 2 millennia, the world heard its verses. It was a moment of cultural shock. Here was a story of a flood, older than Genesis. A tale of a serpent and a garden. A hero who sought immortality and found wisdom instead. The Bible was not the first voice in the wilderness. There had been others, more ancient, just as profound. Museums across Europe filled with Mesopotamian treasures. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, each became a sanctuary of clay and stone. And yet, with this rediscovery came questions: who owns the past? Who speaks for the dead? What is the cost of uncovering memory? Today, much of Mesopotamia's heritage lies far from its homeland, a reality born of empire and excavation. But even so, Iraq and the broader region remain the heart of this legacy. Its soil still holds untold stories. Its people, descendants of a mighty tradition, still walk the ground where writing was born. And as modern scholars continue to study the tablets, translate the myths, and preserve the ruins, the ancient voices speak ever more clearly. They tell us not only who they were, but who we are. In an age of satellites and skyscrapers, of digital scrolls and global tongues, why should we still listen to the voices of Mesopotamia? Why pause to read the words pressed into ancient clay, to study the deeds of kings whose dust has long blown away? Because in those ancient syllables, in those broken walls, we find the roots of ourselves. Mesopotamia matters not because it was perfect, but because it was first. First to write. First to legislate. First to ask, in a lasting form, what it means to live together as human beings, with laws, with gods, with memory. Its influence is not buried, it is alive in the very ways we think and measure and hope. Each time we check the hour, we borrow their base 60 mathematics. Each time we sign a contract or write a name, we echo their need for permanence. Each time we seek justice, we continue their vision of law as a force beyond mere power. Their questions remain our own. What is just? What endures? What lies beyond death? Mesopotamia began as a response to the chaos of nature, rivers that flooded without warning, skies that flashed with unpredictable fire. Its people built canals to guide the waters, walls to protect their homes, temples to seek favor, and words to make sense of the world. In doing so, they laid the foundation of civilization. But perhaps their greatest achievement was not the cities they raised, the empires they forged, or even the texts they wrote. It was the idea that memory matters, that the past can speak, and that in listening, we find wisdom. For thousands of years, they waited in silence. Now they speak again. Not in command, but in invitation. To remember. To reflect. To carry forward. So long as we care to ask where we came from, Mesopotamia will answer. And in that answer, we may yet find a better way forward. Among all the cities that rose upon the Mesopotamian plain, one stands foremost in memory and myth, Uruk. It was here, in the 4th millennium BCE, that the idea of the city reached a scale and complexity unknown before. With its thick walls stretching kilometers long, its grand temples dedicated to Inanna and Anu, and its bustling districts of craftsmen and scribes, Uruk was not merely a settlement, it was a new kind of world. Archaeologists speak of the Uruk period, not only to name a place, but a revolution. For during these centuries, the very fabric of society changed. Villages became neighborhoods. Clay huts gave way to public buildings. Economic life expanded beyond barter to include tokens, tallies, and soon, writing. Long before cuneiform became script, it was first a series of signs etched on small tablets in Uruk, used to track goods, labor, and ownership. This was no accident. A city demanded record. It demanded memory. The people of Uruk answered with innovation. Cylinder seals were invented here, tiny cylinders rolled over wet clay, leaving impressions that confirmed identity and intent. They were signatures in stone. With each seal came accountability. With each tablet, a new trust. Commerce flourished. Goods came in from distant lands, copper from the Persian Gulf, obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from far Bactria. In return, Uruk sent out textiles, grain, and ideas. Its cultural influence spread in waves, its architecture, tools, and administration visible in settlements hundreds of kilometers away. And at the center of it all stood the temples. The white temple atop the ziggurat of Anu, gleaming under the sun, marked the sacred heart of the city. Priests kept the calendar, managed the economy, mediated between gods and men. Here, religion was not separate from the state, it was the state, guiding all. Uruk gave the world not only cities and writing, but a figure both historic and legendary, Gilgamesh. Whether king or myth, he stands as a symbol of humanity's eternal quest for power, for wisdom, for life without end. In Uruk, we see the turning point, the moment when human life moved from nature's rhythm to its own. When people chose to live not by the river's whim, but by laws and ledgers, by temples and towers. The city was born. And with it, the modern world began. In the memory of Uruk, one name towers above all others, Gilgamesh. He was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 man, a paradox made flesh. A builder of walls, a breaker of beasts, a seeker of immortality. Whether he lived as a king or emerged from myth, his story is the oldest epic we possess, a tale not only of conquest, but of self. The Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets and rediscovered in the ruins of Nineveh, speaks across time with startling clarity. It is not merely a chronicle of deeds, but a meditation on the nature of being, on friendship, grief, legacy, and the fear of death. The tale begins with power unchecked. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is mighty and cruel, his will oppressive to his people. In response, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe, equal in strength, innocent of civilization. When they meet, they wrestle. They fight to a standstill. And from that struggle, a bond is born. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embark on heroic quests. They slay Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest. They kill the bull of heaven sent by the scorned goddess Ishtar. Their victories are great, but the gods are not pleased. Enkidu falls ill. He dies. And in his death, Gilgamesh discovers a truth deeper than any conquest, that all power must end. That the grave waits even for kings. Shattered, he sets out in search of Utnapishtim, the immortal man, survivor of the Great Flood. Through mountains and darkness, over oceans and silence, Gilgamesh journeys not to win, but to understand. When at last he reaches Utnapishtim, he hears the tale of a deluge sent by gods who regretted their wrath. Of a boat built in haste. Of animals saved 2 by 2. Of a life granted without end, but only once. Gilgamesh is offered a test to win eternal life. He fails. He is given a plant of renewal. He loses it to a serpent. He returns to Uruk, empty-handed. And yet, not empty. For in the end, he sees the walls he has built. The people who live within them. The life that, though brief, has meaning. Look at the rampart of Uruk, he says. Walk upon it. Examine its foundation. Touch the threshold. These are the things that endure. Thus, the epic closes not in triumph, but in understanding. Gilgamesh cannot escape death. But he can shape life. And that, the tale tells us, is enough. In Gilgamesh, we find the first truly human hero, not flawless, but searching. Not victorious, but wise. And in his journey, we see our own. Among the many tales that echo from Mesopotamian tablets, few resonate more deeply, or more widely, than the story of the flood. Told in the Epic of Gilgamesh and earlier in the Atrahasis epic, it recounts how the gods, angered by the noise and disobedience of humankind, resolved to destroy the world with a deluge. One man, warned by a god, built a great boat. He saved his family, his animals, and the seeds of life. When the floodwaters receded, the boat came to rest on a mountain. A bird was released. The man offered sacrifice. And the gods, seeing his faithfulness, granted him a kind of immortality. Sound familiar? This tale, written centuries before the Hebrew Bible, carries striking parallels with the story of Noah. And yet, it is uniquely Mesopotamian in its tone and theology. The gods are not all-knowing. They argue. They regret. One, Enki, acts in secret to save life from divine wrath. The flood is not merely punishment, it is a reset. A chance for balance to be restored. What does this tell us? It tells us that stories flow like rivers. That ideas travel, across cultures, across languages, across centuries. The Mesopotamians did not just build cities, they built the foundations of shared human narrative. Myths that answered deep questions: why do we suffer? What is justice? Is there hope after loss? These myths were not written to amuse. They were guides. Mirrors. Rituals in word form. They shaped the worldview of priests and kings, of farmers and scribes. They provided meaning in a world full of mystery. They allowed people to believe that though life was short and the gods unpredictable, there was wisdom to be found, and beauty in the search. When we read these tales today, we are not just learning about ancient belief. We are encountering the ancient soul, the first great attempts to give voice to what lies beyond the visible. The flood, the fall, the journey, the return, all these themes begin here, between the rivers. And from here, they continue. Through scripture, through legend, through every story that seeks to understand who we are and why we endure. If one were to choose a single invention that transformed humanity more than any other, it might well be writing. In Mesopotamia, the written word did not begin with poetry or prophecy, it began with grain. With cattle. With numbers. It was born from the need to remember trade, to track labor, to mark ownership. But from this humble purpose emerged a revolution of mind. Cuneiform, or wedge-shaped, is the name we give it now, from the Latin. It began as pictographs drawn on clay with a reed stylus. Over centuries, it became abstract, linear, versatile. By 2600 BCE, it was no longer mere bookkeeping, it had become literature, prayer, law, and thought. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets have survived, more than from any other ancient culture. They were durable, practical, and everywhere. In temple archives. In palace libraries. In merchant homes. In schools, where students practiced their signs endlessly, their mistakes still visible beneath the teacher's correction. What did they write? Everything. Contracts and court records. inventories and loans, hymns to the gods and curses upon enemies, love letters, medical instructions, royal inscriptions carved deep into stone, and epics, those long songs of kings, gods, and loss. The scribes, trained from youth, were a class unto themselves. They were not only recorders of fact, but keepers of memory. Theirs was a sacred duty. They copied texts with care, preserving old stories long after their original context was gone. They believed that to write was to bind time, that a name set in clay would outlast the flesh. And they were right. Even when cities fell and languages faded, the tablets remained. Silent. Waiting. When modern scholars began to decipher them in the 19th century, the ancient voices returned. Not as ghosts, but as neighbors. Telling us who they were, what they feared, what they loved, and what they dreamed. And perhaps most moving of all is this: they knew we would forget them. One Sumerian proverb, pressed into a small clay tablet over 4,000 years ago, reads, "A name not written down vanishes like smoke." They wrote to be remembered. And in reading them, we fulfill that wish. Though millennia have passed since the ziggurats towered and the scribes pressed symbols into clay, Mesopotamia has never truly vanished. Its spirit lingers, silent, steady, in the words we speak, the systems we follow, the questions we still ask. Consider time. Why does the hour have 60 minutes? Why does the circle have 360 degrees? These are remnants of Mesopotamia's base 60 mathematics, a system so elegant and practical, it endures even now. Consider law. The idea that justice can be recorded, that rulers are bound by codes, that evidence must be weighed, these principles trace their ancestry to Hammurabi and the long tradition of scribal courts. Consider cities. The very notion of urban life, organized, led, interdependent, was first realized between the Tigris and Euphrates. When we speak of city planning, taxation, or zoning, we speak in the legacy of Uruk and Babylon. Even our myths carry their breath. The flood, the tower, the quest for eternal life. These stories, born in Mesopotamian clay, were carried westward, reshaped by Hebrew prophets, Greek poets, Christian scribes, and Muslim scholars. They became universal not by force, but by resonance. And in the soil of Iraq, the cradle still cradles. Despite wars, neglect, and looting, new discoveries continue to rise from the earth. A schoolboy's tablet, a merchant's receipt, a temple foundation. Each artifact a fragment of a larger voice, one that speaks not of a vanished world, but of a shared beginning. Modern Iraq, though burdened by conflict and change, remains a land of memory. Its rivers still run. Its people still speak ancient names. And its role in the human story is not past, it is foundational. To walk its land is to walk upon the layers of our collective becoming. In every museum, in every translated tablet, in every university where cuneiform is taught, the voice of Mesopotamia lives. Not loudly, not boastfully, but firmly, patiently, like the rivers themselves. Mesopotamia, land of reeds and rivers, of scribes and stars, was never just a place. It was an idea, a beginning, a proving ground where humanity first tested the tools of civilization, language, law, belief, and belonging. Here, for the first time, people imagined cities not as camps, but as living entities. They imagined writing not as art, but as preservation. They imagined that the world could be read, its signs interpreted, its cycles mapped, its chaos ordered. And though its temples are ruins now, its walls broken, its gods long silent, the heart of Mesopotamia still beats in our shared memory. Every written word, every measured day, every law upheld, every story told, they all carry within them the faint imprint of a stylus pressed into wet clay. Mesopotamia teaches us that greatness is not found only in conquest, nor wisdom only in silence. It shows us that even the earliest of peoples, standing on the edge of time, reached upward, not blindly, but with vision. To understand, to endure, to leave behind a voice. That voice, once buried beneath earth and empire, now lives again. And so we listen, not to mourn a vanished world, but to remember that we are never far from our origins. For as long as rivers flow and minds inquire, as long as memory is cherished and words are shared, Mesopotamia remains. Not behind us, but within us.